Officer Marcus Donnelly had been with the Chicago Police Department for 6 years when he walked into a situation that would obliterate his career and cost the city $19.8 million. He was 31 years old, experienced enough to recognize context, trained repeatedly in de-escalation, but apparently convinced that his authority superseded evidence, common sense, and basic investigative procedure. One Saturday evening in June, in an upscale neighborhood on Chicago's North Side, he responded to a noise complaint about a backyard gathering and decided that the elegant black woman in a silk dress hosting the party couldn't possibly own the $1.2 million brownstone she was standing in front of. What Donnelly did next, ignoring her identification, dismissing witness statements from 30 party guests, and arresting a sitting state Supreme Court justice in front of her fiancé, family, and colleagues, would become a textbook example of how racial profiling destroys lives, careers, and public trust in law enforcement. A black woman in her late 40s, Judge Nadia Clarke, was standing in the brick-paved driveway of her Lincoln Park brownstone on a warm June evening, greeting arriving guests for her engagement celebration. Her Illinois State Bar Association ring was visible on her right hand. Car keys dangled from her left. No crime, no trespassing, no violation. Just a jurist welcoming friends and family to a milestone celebration at her own home. But Officer Donnelly saw her through a filter so distorted by assumptions about who belongs in wealthy neighborhoods that he couldn't imagine a black woman as the legitimate owner of a seven-figure property. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. The brownstone at 2847 North Burling Street sits on a tree-lined block in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's most affluent neighborhoods. It's the kind of street where historic three-story homes sell for over $1 million, where BMWs and Teslas line the curbs, where residents host garden parties and wine tastings in carefully landscaped backyards. Judge Clarke's home, purchased in 2014, features original crown molding, a renovated chef's kitchen, and a backyard oasis with string lights, a stone patio, and mature flowering trees. It was 6:38 p.m. on a Saturday in mid-June. The temperature had just dropped to a comfortable 78 degrees after a humid afternoon. Golden hour sunlight filtered through the trees. Judge Clarke's backyard was alive with celebration, about 40 guests mingling on the patio, soft jazz playing from outdoor speakers, caterers circulating with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The party had started at 5 p.m. Laughter carried over the fence, but the music was set at a conversational volume, well below Chicago's noise ordinance threshold. The kind of Saturday evening where neighbors typically smile and wave, not call the police. Judge Nadia Clarke had been on the Illinois State Supreme Court for 3 years, the culmination of a career spent building her expertise in constitutional law, civil rights litigation, and criminal justice reform. Before her appointment to the state's highest court, she'd served 11 years on the Illinois Appellate Court, where she authored 47 majority opinions, many of them cited in subsequent cases nationwide. Before that, 8 years as a Cook County Circuit Court judge, presiding over complex civil litigation and criminal trials, with a reputation for fairness, meticulous preparation, and zero tolerance for procedural gamesmanship. Judge Clarke had graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern University School of Law, where she'd served as editor of the Northwestern University Law Review. Before law school, she'd earned her undergraduate degree in political science from Howard University, graduating summa cum laude with honors in her major. After law school, she'd clerked for a federal appellate judge, then joined a prestigious civil rights law firm where she litigated voting rights cases, employment discrimination suits, and wrongful conviction appeals. Her work helped exonerate 3 men who'd served a combined 47 years for crimes they didn't commit. At 48 years old, Judge Clarke was exactly where she'd worked to be. Respected by colleagues across the political spectrum, trusted with some of the most consequential legal questions facing Illinois, and recently engaged to Dr. Raymond Foster, a cardiothoracic surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. They'd met 3 years earlier at a medical legal symposium on healthcare policy. He proposed in April during a weekend trip to Napa Valley. That Saturday, Judge Clarke had spent the morning at her chambers reviewing briefs for an upcoming oral argument. She'd left the courthouse at 2 p.m., stopped at Whole Foods for last-minute supplies, and returned home to prepare for the party. She'd changed into an elegant silk cocktail dress, emerald green, sleeveless, tailored perfectly, and her favorite pearl earrings. Her engagement ring, a 2-carat diamond set in platinum, caught the light every time she moved her hand. She wore minimal makeup and her natural hair styled in elegant locks that fell past her shoulders. She looked like what she was, a woman celebrating a personal milestone in her own home with people she loved. She'd invited colleagues from the court, law school friends, neighbors, family members who'd driven in from out of state. Every guest had received a printed invitation 3 weeks earlier, with the address clearly listed. Caterers had been setting up since 4 p.m. Everything was planned, legal, permitted where required, and entirely within her rights as a homeowner. But to someone watching from across the street, Judge Nadia Clarke's celebration was a problem, and that person had decided to do something about it. Marcus Donnelly was 31 years old. He'd been a patrol officer with the Chicago Police Department for 6 years, assigned to the 18th District covering Lincoln Park and surrounding neighborhoods. He was efficient, confident in his instincts, and deeply invested in what he called maintaining community standards. His supervisors described him in evaluations as proactive, but sometimes lacking in judgment regarding when intervention is actually necessary. In 6 years, Officer Donnelly had compiled a record that should have triggered immediate supervisory concern. 9 complaints. 9. 7 of them involved allegations of racial profiling or discriminatory treatment of black residents in predominantly white neighborhoods. 2 had been sustained, resulting in written reprimands and mandatory bias training. The other 7 had been closed as not sustained, despite witness statements and body camera footage that supervisors chose to interpret as ambiguous. Donnelly had a pattern. He questioned black residents in ways he didn't question white residents. A black man unloading groceries from his car in Lakeview was stopped and asked for proof he lived in the building. Donnelly claimed he matched the description of a burglary suspect from 3 weeks earlier in a different neighborhood. A black woman jogging through Lincoln Park at 7 a.m. was detained for 20 minutes while Donnelly ran her ID, claiming she fit the description of someone wanted for shoplifting. A black family having a picnic in Oz Park was questioned about whether they had proper permits, even though permits aren't required for family gatherings. Every complaint told the same story. Donnelly saw black people in affluent areas and assumed they didn't belong there. The pattern was clear. The documentation was extensive, but somehow Donnelly remained on patrol, his supervisors noting that he needed to improve his community relations approach, but never connecting the incidents into a broader pattern of discriminatory policing. That Saturday at 6:32 p.m., Donnelly received a dispatch call. Noise complaint at 2847 North Burling Street. Caller reporting loud music and possible trespassing. The caller, a neighbor who lived 3 doors down, had told the dispatcher that the party seemed suspicious, that she didn't recognize most of the people there, and that she was concerned about property values. Donnelly responded immediately. In his mind, the call confirmed what he believed about Lincoln Park. The neighborhood needed protection from people who didn't belong there. He didn't consider that engagement parties typically include guests the neighbors wouldn't recognize. He didn't think about whether music audible from a backyard constituted a violation. He just knew that someone had called about a disturbance, and he was going to handle it. Donnelly arrived at 6:38 p.m., parking his squad car directly in front of Judge Clarke's brownstone. He stepped out and immediately heard music, soft jazz, barely audible. From the street, nowhere near violation levels. He heard laughter and conversation from the backyard. He scanned the street and saw several well-dressed people walking toward the house, carrying gift bags and wine bottles. His eyes landed on Judge Clarke, who was standing in her driveway greeting 2 guests who'd just arrived. She was smiling, holding a champagne flute, her emerald dress and diamond ring catching the early evening light. Donnelly saw a black woman in front of an expensive house in Lincoln Park. In his mind, that required investigation. He walked directly toward her. Do you think officers should face automatic suspension after receiving 5 complaints for racial profiling? Drop your answer below. Judge Clarke was laughing at something her colleague had just said when she became aware of someone approaching with purpose. She turned and saw a Chicago police officer, hand resting on his belt, walking toward her with an expression she'd seen too many times in courtrooms. Authority mixed with assumption. "You need to step away from the property." Clarke blinked, the smile fading from her face. "Excuse me? We received multiple calls about a disturbance. Loud music, trespassing." Clarke glanced back at her house, then at the officer, genuinely confused. "There's no disturbance. We're celebrating my engagement. This is a private party." Donnelly's jaw tightened. "How many people are inside?" "About 40 guests. All invited. Is there a problem?" "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the property line and provide identification." Clarke felt the shift in the air, the moment when a simple interaction became something else. She'd presided over enough cases to recognize what was happening. She kept her voice calm, professional, the same tone she used from the bench. "Officer, I live here. This is my home. I'm hosting a party for my friends and family." Donnelly crossed his arms. "The homeowner called to report trespassing. I am the homeowner. I've lived here since 2014. Behind Clarke, several guests had noticed the interaction. The conversation in the driveway went quiet. People turned to watch. "I need to see identification. Now." Clarke set down her champagne flute on the brick wall next to her driveway. She reached into the small clutch purse she'd set on the wall and pulled out her wallet. She extracted her driver's license, Illinois issued, with her name and this exact address printed clearly, and held it up. "Here, driver's license. Nadia Clarke, 2847 North Burling Street. Same address as this property." Donnelly took the license and glanced at it briefly. His expression didn't change. "Anyone can print a fake ID. I need to verify ownership of this property." Clarke felt her professional composure crack slightly. "A fake ID? This is a valid Illinois driver's license. You can verify it in your system. I need to verify with the actual homeowner. I am the actual homeowner. I can show you the deed if you'd like to wait while I retrieve it from inside." By now, more guests had emerged from the backyard. Dr. Raymond Foster, Clarke's fiancé, walked up beside her, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "Nadia, what's going on?" Clarke kept her eyes on Donnelly. "This officer doesn't believe I own my house." Donnelly turned to Foster. "Sir, do you live here?" Foster hesitated. "No, but..." "Then I need you to step back." This is where assumptions become accusations. Officer Donnelly had responded to a vague noise complaint in an affluent neighborhood. When he arrived, he saw a black woman hosting what appeared to be an elegant, well-organized celebration. Instead of assessing whether any actual violation was occurring, which it wasn't, his mind filled in a narrative that required this black woman to prove she belonged in this space. When she provided identification with her name and address, he dismissed it as potentially fake. When she offered to retrieve property documents, he refused to wait. Every piece of evidence contradicted his assumption, but his bias was so complete that evidence became obstacles to overcome rather than information to consider. Clarke's voice remained steady, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "Officer, I'm going to tell you something very clearly. I am Judge Nadia Clarke. I serve on the Illinois State Supreme Court. I have owned this property for 9 years. I am hosting my engagement party. You have no legal basis to question my presence here. I'm asking you now to leave my property." Donnelly's expression hardened further. "I don't care if you're the governor. Put your hands behind your back." The driveway went completely silent. Someone gasped. Phones came out immediately. At least 6 guests began recording. Foster stepped forward. "Wait, you're arresting her? For what?" Donnelly didn't look at him. Trespassing and obstruction. Clarke knew the moment had arrived where she had to choose. Escalate this into a confrontation that could turn violent or comply, and let the catastrophic nature of Donnelly's mistake play out in full public view. She chose documentation. "I'm complying under protest. Everyone here is a witness. I am Judge Nadia Clarke, Illinois State Supreme Court. This officer is arresting me at my own engagement party for standing in my own driveway. Please record everything." The guests were recording from multiple angles now. A woman Clarke recognized as a fellow judge pulled out her phone. 2 attorneys from her former law firm were filming. Foster stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock and fury. Clarke turned slowly and placed her hands behind her back. Donnelly pulled out his handcuffs. "Officer, there is no need for handcuffs. I'm complying completely." Donnelly ignored her. He snapped the cuffs on, tight, the metal biting into her wrists. Clarke winced but said nothing. "You're under arrest for trespassing on private property. I own this property. You've seen my identification. You're making a catastrophic mistake. You can explain it at the station." From the crowd, voices rose in protest. A man Clarke didn't recognize called out, "This is illegal. She's the homeowner." An older woman said, "I'm her neighbor. I can confirm she lives here." Another voice, "This is insane. Call your supervisor." Donnelly ignored them all. He placed his hand on Clarke's elbow, unnecessarily firm, and guided her toward his patrol car parked on the street. Clarke looked back at Foster. "Raymond, call Attorney General Harris. Tell him what happened. Call the courthouse. And make sure everyone saves their videos." Donnelly opened the back door of his squad car. Clarke, still wearing her emerald silk dress and diamond engagement ring, was placed in the back seat like a common criminal. Her guests stood in her driveway, phones raised, recording the entire scene. As Donnelly closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, Clarke sat perfectly still, her legal mind already constructing the case she would bring against him and the city that employed him. Should officers be required to verify property ownership before making arrests on trespassing charges? Let me know what you think. The drive to the 18th District Station took 9 minutes. Clarke spent them documenting everything mentally: times, statements, witnesses, physical force. She'd reviewed hundreds of police misconduct cases from the bench. She knew exactly what evidence mattered. They arrived at the station at 6:54 p.m. Donnelly walked her inside, still handcuffed, past the front desk where Sergeant Patricia Moreno looked up with immediate alarm. "Donnelly, what do you have?" "Trespassing at 2847 North Burling. Suspect was hosting an unauthorized party at a residence she doesn't own." Moreno stood, her eyes narrowing. Did she resist? She refused to leave when instructed. Clarke spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding courtrooms. "Sergeant, I am Judge Nadia Clarke, Illinois State Supreme Court. I was arrested at my own home while hosting my engagement party. I provided Officer Donnelly with identification showing my name and address matching the property. I offered to retrieve my property deed. He arrested me anyway. I complied completely. There was no resistance, and this entire incident was recorded by approximately 30 witnesses. The color drained from Moreno's face. Clarke met her eyes steadily. "I'm a sitting justice on the state's highest court. Officer Donnelly arrested me for standing in my own driveway." Moreno's hand moved to her radio. "Captain Reyes to the front desk. Immediate." Donnelly pulled Clarke's driver's license from his pocket and handed it to Moreno. She examined it. "Nadia Clarke, State Supreme Court Justice, 2847 North Burling Street. Donnelly, this is her address. Could be stolen." Captain Miguel Reyes arrived within 90 seconds. A 23-year veteran with a reputation for no-nonsense leadership, he took one. Look at Judge Clarke standing in handcuffs in an evening gown, and knew exactly how bad this was. "Someone explain what's happening." Moreno handed him the license. "Sir, Officer Donnelly arrested Judge Nadia Clarke, State Supreme Court, at her own residence during what appears to have been a private party." Reyes examined the license, then looked at Donnelly. "You arrested a State Supreme Court justice? She was trespassing. At her own house? The homeowner called about a disturbance." Reyes turned to Clarke. "Ma'am, I apologize for the handcuffs. We're removing them immediately." He nodded to Moreno, who unlocked them with swift efficiency. Clarke rubbed her wrists. Deep red marks were visible where the metal had pressed into her skin. "Thank you, Captain. But I want Officer Donnelly's badge number, his supervisor's name, a copy of the dispatch call that sent him to my residence, and the name of whoever called 911. I also want confirmation that your body camera system captured this arrest, because I'm building a federal civil rights case, and I need that footage preserved immediately." Reyes nodded grimly. "You'll have everything you're requesting." He turned to Donnelly, his voice dropping to something cold. "Badge and weapon." You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Donnelly's face went pale. Captain, I was responding to a legitimate call. You arrested a sitting state Supreme Court justice at her own house after she showed you identification proving she lived there. Give me your badge. Donnelly's hands shook as he unclipped his badge and handed it over, followed by his service weapon. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the magnitude of what he'd done. Reyes turned back to Clarke. Judge Clarke, again. My deepest apologies on behalf of the Chicago Police Department. This should never have happened. Clarke's response was measured but firm. Captain, I appreciate your apology, but this isn't about one officer's mistake. This is about a pattern. Officer Donnelly has 9 complaints in 6 years, 7 involving allegations of racial profiling. This arrest happened because he saw a black woman in Lincoln Park and couldn't imagine she belonged there. Your apology doesn't change that systemic problem. Within 2 hours, the story had exploded across every platform. Multiple videos from different angles showed everything. Judge Clarke calmly presenting identification, Donnelly dismissing it, Clarke identifying herself as a state Supreme Court justice, Donnelly arresting her anyway, Clarke being handcuffed and placed in a police car while wearing an evening gown. Chicago police arrest, state Supreme Court justice at her own engagement party, sitting judge handcuffed in designer dress. After officer refuses to verify property ownership. I don't care if you're the governor. Video shows, cop arresting state's highest court judge for trespassing at her own home. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The Illinois Attorney General issued a statement within 3 hours demanding a full investigation. The governor called Judge Clarke personally to apologize. The ACLU announced they were reviewing the case for a potential federal civil rights lawsuit. Legal scholars appeared on cable news calling it one of the most egregious examples of racial profiling they'd ever documented. Officer Donnelly's life imploded within 48 hours. The administrative investigation confirmed everything. 9 complaints in 6 years, 7 involving racial profiling, 2 sustained violations. The body camera footage showed Donnelly dismissing Judge Clarke's identification without even attempting to verify it in the system. The dispatch recording revealed the original caller had no basis for claiming trespassing. She simply didn't recognize the guests and thought the party seemed suspicious. The Chicago Police Department placed Donnelly on unpaid leave, pending termination proceedings. His attorney released a brief statement. Officer Donnelly regrets any misunderstanding and is cooperating fully with the investigation. The statement fooled no one. Judge Clarke contacted the ACLU's Illinois chapter within 24 hours. They connected her with a civil rights attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later. The defendants included Officer Marcus Donnelly individually, Captain Miguel Reyes for supervisory failure to address Donnelly's documented pattern of discrimination, Sergeant Patricia Moreno for inadequate oversight, and the City of Chicago for systemic failure to discipline officers with multiple substantiated complaints. The claims were comprehensive: unlawful arrest without probable cause, false imprisonment and illegal detention, violation of Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure, violation of 14th Amendment, equal protection rights, racial profiling, excessive use of force, unnecessarily tight handcuffs causing injury, intentional infliction of emotional distress, failure to train and supervise officers with documented patterns of discriminatory behavior, failure to implement adequate systems to track and respond to complaint patterns. The complaint meticulously detailed Donnelly's history. 9 complaints over 6 years, 7 involving allegations of racial profiling, 2 sustained violations resulting only in written reprimands and training that clearly had no effect. All documented, all available in department files, all ignored until Donnelly arrested someone with the resources and knowledge to fight back effectively. The City of Chicago's legal team reviewed the evidence and reached the conclusion they'd been dreading: completely indefensible. Judge Clarke was a sitting state Supreme Court justice with impeccable credentials. She'd been arrested at her own home during a private celebration. She'd provided identification, proving ownership. The arrest was captured on video from multiple angles. Donnelly had 9 prior complaints. The department had documentation of his pattern and had done nothing meaningful to stop it. The city settled 14 months later. $19.8 million paid to Judge Nadia Clarke. The settlement also required the Chicago Police Department to implement comprehensive reforms: automatic suspension for any officer who receives 5 complaints involving allegations of discrimination within a 5-year period, mandatory supervisory review and intervention after 3 complaints, creation of an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power, quarterly public reporting of all complaint data, broken down by officer, alleged violation, and outcome. Officer Marcus Donnelly was terminated 11 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was direct and final. Officer Donnelly arrested a sitting Illinois State Supreme Court justice at her own residence without probable cause, refused to verify identification that clearly established her ownership of the property, and used unnecessary force in handcuffing a fully compliant victim. This incident represents the culmination of a 6-year pattern of discriminatory policing, documented in 9 complaints, 7 involving allegations of racial profiling. Despite 2 sustained violations and mandatory training interventions, Officer Donnelly continued to engage in behavior that violates department policy, constitutional protections, and basic standards of professional conduct. His employment is terminated effective immediately. Donnelly's name was entered into the National Decertification Index, a database that prevents fired officers from being rehired in other jurisdictions. His law enforcement career ended at 31 years old. He has not worked in policing since. Should officers with 5 or more complaints for discrimination face automatic decertification? Drop your answer below. Judge Nadia Clarke testified before the Chicago City Council during hearings on police reform. Her testimony was measured, powerful, and devastating. I'm a sitting justice on the Illinois State Supreme Court. I have 22 years of experience in the legal system, as an attorney, as a trial judge, as an appellate judge, and now on the state's highest court. I graduated from one of the nation's top law schools. I've authored judicial opinions that have shaped civil rights law in this state. She paused, letting her credentials settle. On June 18th, I was standing in the driveway of my own home, hosting my engagement party, when Officer Marcus Donnelly arrested me for trespassing. I showed him my driver's license with my name and address matching the property. He called it potentially fake. I offered to retrieve my property deed. He refused to wait. I identified myself as a state Supreme Court justice. He said he didn't care. He handcuffed me in front of 40 witnesses, placed me in his squad car, and drove me to the station like a criminal. Another pause. Several council members shifted uncomfortably. Officer Donnelly had 9 complaints in 6 years. 9. 7 of them involved allegations that he targeted black residents in ways he didn't target white residents. 2 were sustained violations. But Officer Donnelly remained on patrol. Why? Because your department treats each complaint in isolation. You never connected the pattern. You gave him training that he ignored. You gave him written reprimands that meant nothing. And so he continued, targeting black people in affluent neighborhoods, until he arrested the wrong person. Her voice strengthened. $19.8 million is significant. It's accountability in a system that rarely holds officers accountable. But money doesn't undo the trauma of being handcuffed at your own engagement party. Money doesn't restore the dignity of being arrested in front of your fiancé, your colleagues, your family. Money doesn't erase the message that even when you're a state Supreme Court justice with credentials and proof of ownership, you can still be treated like a criminal if you're black in a neighborhood where someone thinks you don't belong. She looked directly at the council members. If this can happen to me, with all my credentials, all my authority, all my knowledge of the law, what happens to people without those protections? What happens to the black teenager walking in Lincoln Park who doesn't have a law degree? What happens to the black family barbecuing in a park who can't afford a civil rights attorney? What happens to every other person who looks like me in this city when officers like Marcus Donnelly are allowed to continue their patterns because no one connects the dots until it's too late? The council chamber was silent. This wasn't about one night in June. This was about a department that had 9 opportunities to remove an officer who repeatedly demonstrated that he saw black people as suspicious by default. This was about a system that values officer protection over community protection. This was about a culture that assumes black people in affluent spaces must be doing something wrong. She paused one final time. $19.8 million is what it cost your city to ignore Marcus Donnelly's pattern for 6 years. How much will the next one cost? Should police departments face federal oversight after settlements exceeding $10 million for civil rights violations? Drop your answer below. This wasn't just about one arrest. This was about a system that allowed Officer Marcus Donnelly to compile 9 complaints over 6 years without meaningful consequence. It was about a department that treated each incident in isolation, never asking why the same officer kept generating the same type of complaint. It was about supervisors who wrote in evaluations that Donnelly needed to improve community relations, but never questioned whether an officer who couldn't interact appropriately with black residents should remain on patrol. Donnelly's record told a story his supervisors didn't want to read. 9 complaints, 7 involving racial profiling. 2 sustained, resulting in written warnings and training sessions that clearly changed nothing. The pattern was unmistakable, but the Chicago Police Department, like too many departments, treated patterns as coincidence and documentation as bureaucratic inconvenience. Marcus Donnelly's career is over. That's justice. The city paid $19.8 million. That's accountability. Chicago implemented comprehensive reforms, including automatic suspension after 5 discrimination complaints. That's progress. But money and policy changes don't undo the harm. They don't restore Judge Clarke's sense of safety in her own neighborhood. They don't erase the moment she was handcuffed in front of guests who'd come to celebrate her engagement. They don't change the fact that even a state Supreme Court justice with proof of ownership wasn't enough to overcome an officer's assumption that a black woman in Lincoln Park must be trespassing. The real question is, what changes now? Do police departments finally remove officers after 5 complaints instead of 9? Do they finally connect the dots at complaint 3 when the pattern becomes clear? Do supervisors finally prioritize community safety over protecting officers with documented problems? Do we finally acknowledge that racial profiling isn't always violent or dramatic? Sometimes it's quiet, insidious, built into everyday assumptions about who belongs where. It's an officer who sees a black woman in an expensive neighborhood and assumes she must be trespassing, even when she's standing in her own driveway with identification in her hand. Because if we don't fix the systems that kept Donnelly on patrol through 9 complaints, if we don't address the culture that taught him to see black residents as inherently suspicious, then we're just waiting for the next officer, the next victim, the next $20 million settlement. Comment if you believe this should be federal law. Police departments must terminate any officer who receives 5 complaints for racial profiling or discrimination within 5 years, with no exceptions. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with awareness and change starts with public pressure, then hit that subscribe button. Because we're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing these patterns. We're going to keep demanding that departments connect the dots before officers like Marcus Donnelly arrest people like Judge Nadia Clarke. We're going to keep fighting for every person who deserves to exist in their own neighborhood, in their own home, on their own property without being treated like a criminal. This isn't just about one officer or one judge. It's about all of us and the society we're willing to accept. It's about whether we demand better or wait for the next viral video, the next arrest, the next settlement that confirms what we already know, that for some people, no credential is enough when bias has already made its decision. Judge Nadia Clarke went back to her work on the Illinois State Supreme Court. She continues to author opinions on civil rights, criminal justice reform, and equal protection under the law. She married Dr. Raymond Foster in a private ceremony 8 months after the arrest. And she continues to speak about police accountability, systemic reform, and the reality that even the most accomplished black professionals aren't protected from assumptions about where they belong. Because that's the truth this story tells. Until we fix the systems that allow officers to target black people without consequence, until we demand accountability after complaint 3 instead of waiting for complaint 9, until we acknowledge that racial profiling is a pattern we can document and must stop, we're just accepting that this will keep happening. And accepting that is unacceptable.